Thank you very much. Good afternoon. As Professor Singer and Professor Hulse mentioned, 3 judges for this, and it was very clear what 2 of them brought to the prize. Professor Field was representing medicine, and Gwyneth was representing, as you just heard, fantastically there, poetry. So what did I bring to it? Well, I've seen every single episode of Holby City ever shown. One of my children is a current medical student. And perhaps more crucially, I'm a terrible hypochondriac. And in fact, at the gym yesterday evening, something went at in my left heel. So if there are any back of the foot specialists in the room, if I could see you afterwards, or indeed any poets who can recommend a poem that might help that current pain. But the reason I was so thrilled to be asked to judge this prize, and I found it the most fascinating of all the literary prizes I've judged, and I have actually, I think, now judged every literary prize in Britain, apart from the Orange Prize for women's fiction, for which I would require a major operation before I was allowed to. But the reason I was so keen to do it is that I have always been fascinated, without necessarily thinking of it as medical writing or medical poetry, been fascinated by a couple of traditions in literature. One of them is the poet-patient. One of my favourite writers of all, John Updike, the late, we sadly have to say, American novelist. In 2008, when he was diagnosed with first pneumonia, and then it turned out to be terminal lung cancer, which killed him within 3 months, he wrote a final book called Endpoint. It was a book of poetry. Now, Updike had written poetry throughout his career, but he was better known as a novelist, a short story writer, an essayist. And I was fascinated that he, at the very end, knowing there could only be one more book, he turned to poetry. Now, there is a practical aspect to that, and it has to be carefully phrased, because poets understandably get very upset when people think that they knock it off very quickly. But there is something in this, I think, in that there's a famous cartoon where the patient says to the doctor, how bad is it? And the doctor says, well, put it this way, don't start reading any long novels. And that would also apply to not writing any long novels and being incapable of doing so. But I think more importantly, which is what this prize is about, poetry is, appropriately in this context, I think the most internalized form of writing and the most personal. Reading a lot of the entries for this competition, I thought of the thing that Beethoven wrote on one of his scores, it comes from the heart, may it go to the heart. Sometimes these poems literally did. There was a little subset of cardiac poems, just as there were many others in different fields. As Gwyneth says, there were dementia poems, there were road traffic accident poems. We got all these little groups as we judged the many entries. But I think that is crucial, that poetry for me it's the art form of the heart. It's where people can express. I think concentrated is the word. It's not to do with it being short or it being not taking very long to write. It's to do with an element of concentration, literally, that comes into poetry that is harder in other forms. I've also always been fascinated by the tradition of the writer-doctor, which is, again, another tradition very strongly represented in these awards. It was a matter of great astonishment to me when I discovered as a student that Chekhov, one of my favourite writers, had also been a considerable doctor. And then over the years you discover just how many there are, up to and including in the present day Danny Apsey. But when I was researching this subject for an article I was writing, I found a quote from W. Somerset Maugham, who was a medical student and very briefly a doctor before he found what a lot of people regarded as his true vocation as a writer. And at some point, another writer said to W. Somerset Maugham, referred to what he called his false start. He said, don't you regret that? All that time you wasted in medicine when you could have been writing. And Maugham said, and I think it could be a motto for these awards, he said he regarded his time as a medical student as his foundation as a writer because, quote, I saw how men died. I saw how they bore pain. I saw what hope looked like, fear and relief. And I don't think it could be better expressed, really, what this award has set out to do, and in the awards we're about to announce, has achieved. It is also fascinating to have these different perspectives around the table. I've judged poetry awards before, and you're, on the whole, discussing poetic technique, and you'll say, tremendous metaphor that works, don't understand, that doesn't scan, don't understand why it's in that rhyme scheme. We did a bit of that, but for example, occasionally we would say, there's a poem, for example, about the birth of a baby, and Gwyneth and I would say, very, very good metaphors there, very nicely organised. And then I think Steve said at one point that the baby would be dead. And so we had these two completely different, but in fact, as it turned out, genuinely complementary perspectives around the table. It made me think very, very deeply about what it is that we're looking for in poetry, because very often we're not clear what a line will mean, and I don't think we should be. That's one of the strengths of poetry. But it's very interesting to have somebody who was able to take apart professionally there is a weakness in writers, I think, sometimes, that they just treat other disciplines as a source of metaphor and language and vocabulary. And you can produce very powerful work, but it's very interesting to have someone saying, well, they've misused that, or they haven't understood that, or whatever, and I found that fascinating. Just before we announce the awards, the other thing which, as I've judged all these awards before, and this was the only award to which this applied, is that all the entries were anonymous. There's a big problem judging literary awards, which is that you are sometimes uneasily aware in the room that people are considering the work of their ex-husband and wife or their next husband and wife. And none of this is ever quite stated, but it can hang over the judging process. The beauty of this is that none of us knew until after we'd given the awards whether we hated or loved or related to any of these entrants whatsoever. I don't think we were, but it does really change the nature of what you're doing. It's interesting, if you look at the lists of the winners and the short lists and the commended prizes, I think 6 writers have 2 poems in. Now, if you were judging them on name, you would very carefully avoid that as a judging panel. And it shows, it is a perfect example of blind testing in that way, that we were, I think in a number of cases, quite surprised to discover that one poet had written 2 of the poems because they seemed so different. So it was a fascinating process for me. It hasn't actually done anything to cure my hypochondria, but perhaps that was too much to expect, and it may even, in some cases, made it worse. There are in those poems, there were things I never even thought I might have, and now I do. But that certainly wasn't the fault of the Hippocrates. And I would like to hand over to Professor Field, who will go through. I should quickly explain, you probably know all this, but there are 2 different categories: the NHS, which is for NHS entries, and the Open, which is, as they used to say in cricket, the rest of the world and the rest of the professions and experiences. So over to Steve.